The very first thing we need to do is to go to blender.org and go ahead and click on Download. At the time of this recording, the most recent release is Blender 3.0. There might be a 3.1 or a 3.0.1, but generally speaking, the tools, features, and interface will be about the same. Whenever there's a really big change or release, I'll go ahead and update this course. If you're using macOS or Linux, you can go ahead and download Blender from here, and even download it from Steam. Once you decide how you want to download Blender, go ahead and click on it and install it. Once you load Blender for the very first time, you'll be greeted by this window. There's a few things to know. For this course, we're going to be using the English language, but you can change the language into any others if you choose. There are many different kinds of shortcuts you can use with Blender. We're going to focus on the default Blender ones, but if you're coming from Maya or Max, you may be interested in checking out the industry one. Next, we're going to use Select by default with left. And the spacebar, we'll leave it on play for now, but I highly suggest in the future you explore using Search for your spacebar. This will allow you to search for any command or menu item just by hitting your spacebar. But because we're going to keep everything by default, we'll just leave the spacebar to play. You could even change the theme into Maya, Moto, or Light. I'll leave it on the Blender Dark by default. If you come up to Edit Preferences, there are a few more things that you can change to help you out. For example, you can change the resolution scale, making Blender a lot bigger, which makes it a lot easier to read, or leave it back to 1. If you find yourself wanting to go back to different kinds of shortcuts, you can do that by clicking on Key Map and then coming up here and changing which kind you want. You can even change the spacebar action all right here. Finally, under System, you can go ahead and enable CUDA, Optics, or HIP depending on your hardware. If you don't have any of these options available, that's okay. You can still follow along and do everything in this course. Alright, you've now installed Blender and you're ready to go. Welcome to the Blender 3.0 series. In this chapter, we're going to cover the basics of Blender. We're going to get a feel for the program, how it functions, what are some of the major tools, and by the end of it, you're going to create your very first 3D render. I'm so excited to take you on this journey. So let's start with the most important thing, the 3D viewport. The 3D viewport is where everything happens. It is a 3D representation of all of your objects in the scene. For example, I can left click on this camera, my cube, or the light, and I can see that these are 3 separate objects in the scene. On the right, you'll notice a few different tools and this weird kind of gizmo thing. If you left click and drag on this gizmo, you can see you can rotate the view. You can even click on any one of these buttons to get a more orthographic or flat view. You can left click and drag on the gray spear here to move around. And you can even use these buttons to zoom in or pan around, or even go right into camera view. This button changes perspective to orthographic. It's quite handy. On the left are going to be all your tools, like move or rotate. You can go ahead and click on any one of these, and you'll see a new gizmo appear, a blue, green, and red that allows you to move your objects in 3D space. The viewport is where you're going to spend the most amount of your time, but there's still a few other important areas inside of Blender. So let's go take a look. At the top left is our File menu. This is where you can open and save scenes, import, link, etc. Your preferences are under Edit, along with a few other things like Undo History, which allows you to see all of your moves in Blender and pick on any one of them to go back to that point. Rendering will be really important throughout this chapter and this course, but for now just know that this is where the menu exists. Window and Help are also quite useful tools if you ever want to research some more into Blender. At the top here, you have different layouts. If you click on any one of them, you can see how they change the way that Blender looks. Blender has a very robust system that allows you to have different customizations if you're modeling, sculpting, or painting textures. And it's fully customizable by you as well, where you can create your own layouts. At the top right, you'll see the outliner. Now this outliner is a hierarchy view of all the objects in your scene. Scenes are made up of things called collections. They function a lot like groups. And this collection has a camera, a cube, and a light. Below the outliner is the properties panel. And this is going to have every single kind of property from rendering settings to the color of the light to the orientation of the camera. Everything lives inside of properties. If you ever want to change anything about an object, check the properties panel. And finally, at the bottom is the timeline. This allows us to play back our animation simply by clicking on this play button. And when we're done, we can go ahead and click on pause. One more thing I want to mention. As you're moving around your mouse, you might see this little area down here where the mouse icons change. This is like the tooltips area for Blender. As I'm clicking on different things, or even switching into different modes, this whole area down here will give you different hints as to what shortcuts or mouse buttons you can click. At first, the Blender interface can be really daunting, but knowing where all your tools are and how they all work together is going to help you on your Blender journey. One of the most important things about Blender are all the different modes that you have depending on what object you have selected, and how the menu to the right of it changes along with the tools to the left. For example, if I go into edit mode, you'll see I have a whole bunch of different tools, and my menu up here has changed with things like add, mesh, and vertex, etc. If I switch to object mode, you can see that most of that menu disappears and my tools shorten up a little bit. Your menus and tools will change depending on what mode you're in inside of Blender. The shortcut to switch modes is Tab, and that'll take you straight into edit mode, where you'll be spending quite a bit of time. If I hit Tab again, I can now hit Control Tab at the same time and hold it down, and I can see that there are a bunch of other modes that appear, like Texture Paint, Vertex Paint, Weight Paint, or Sculpt mode. This is an important thing about Blender. There are a lot of shortcuts. For example, I can go ahead and hover on Add, and you'll see this shortcut pop up as Shift A. Let's go ahead and do that. Hit Shift A on your keyboard, and you'll see a whole Add area where you can add all sorts of objects to your scene. For those of you who are very savvy and love shortcuts, you'll note that some of these letters have a little underline under them, like M for mesh and P for plane. As you expand your knowledge in the world of Blender, you can one day hit Shift A, M, and P, and that will add a plane to your scene. Now, unfortunately, this little plane is inside of our cube, so we're going to go ahead and move it. I'm going to hover over my Move tool, and I can see that a shortcut appears. Shift Spacebar or G. Now, there's two different ways we can do this. We can either click on the Move tool itself and move our object, or I'm just going to reset back to my select box right here. I can hit G on my keyboard and move it around. Blender has various menus and tools available to you depending on what mode you're using, and all of those items have different shortcuts available to them. So I highly encourage you to hover over different menu items or tools and find out what that shortcut is, because over time, knowing what button to hit right away will speed up your workflow tremendously. In the previous video, we talked a lot about menus and shortcuts inside of Blender. There are three that you must be absolutely familiar with. Middle mouse button, which allows you to rotate around your scene. Shift middle mouse, which lets you shift around or dolly around in your scene. And Control middle mouse, which allows you to zoom in and out of your scene. You can also use the tools over here on the right, but it can be a little cumbersome to use. So I highly encourage you to use middle mouse and just hold it and move around your scene. Shift middle mouse to move around this way, and then Control middle mouse again to zoom in and out. One more thing about navigating the viewport. You might notice this interesting little crosshair that is inside of your scene. This is called the 3D cursor. The best way to think about it is, say, Word or Notepad or TextEdit. Whenever you're in any of those word processing programs, you'll have a blinking cursor that tells you where the next letter will be the moment you tap on your keyboard. The 3D cursor in Blender functions the same way. Whenever you add something to your scene, or if you want to use a pivot at any point in time, the 3D cursor gives you a place for that addition or pivoting to happen. There's two ways to use it. You can go ahead and click on the cursor button here and click around, or you can shift right click. Later on in the course, I'll show you how the 3D cursor can be really beneficial. For now, I just want you to know that the 3D cursor is an incredibly handy tool, so knowing where to place it will be really beneficial. Plus, knowing how to navigate the interface with just a few shortcuts will also improve your Blender workflow. Now that you have a good idea on how to navigate the interface and what a 3D cursor is, let's go ahead and use it. If I go ahead and click on Add, Mesh, and let's go ahead and add a sphere, you can see that my sphere is inside of my cube. I know that because there is this orange highlight, and this is telling me that this is my currently selected object, and that inside of this cube is a ball. However, if I went ahead and shift right clicked over here, or again, if you want to just use the 3D cursor button this way, I can now go to Add, Mesh, UV Sphere, and see that it added a 3D sphere over here off to the left, or really wherever you have your 3D cursor. Let's go ahead and add another object. I'm going to shift right click over here, and instead of clicking on the Add button, I want to get used to shortcuts, so I'm going to use Shift A on my keyboard. I have the exact same menu that I have up there, but now it's much closer to my mouse, so I can quickly pick on any kind of object. Some of my favorites are metaballs. So let's go ahead and click on, say, the capsule metaball. At first, this metaball may mean nothing, but let's go ahead and add another one. So Shift A, metaball. Let's go ahead and add a ball this time. Now, unlike the sphere that was inside the cube, you could see that this metaball changed shape a little bit. It's a little hard to tell, so let's go ahead and click on our Move tool, and then click either the blue, green, or red arrows and move around. Whoa, look at that. Metaballs are these kind of goopy, awesome 3D objects that have been in Blender forever, and they allow you to create some really awesome forms. Now remember how earlier I said you could go ahead and just click on this Move tool, or Rotate, or even Scale? Well, they have shortcuts as well, and it would be good to get familiar with them. So let's go ahead and play with some of these. G is the shortcut for moving. I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter, so that way my ball is placed right here. Next, I'm going to hit G and then Y. Three-dimensional programs have three axes, X, Y, and Z. I'm going to left click right here just to let go of the sphere, and I can come up to my gizmo and I can see that there is a Z, Y, and X, which correspond to the colors green, red, and blue. So if I were to hit G and Z, which corresponds to up and down in 3D space, I can see that I have locked the axis of movement to the Z or up and down axis. If you ever get lost in Blender, you can always look at this 3D gizmo and get an idea of what is front, side, and up. Let's go ahead and add one more object for fun. It's one of my favorites, but before we do, we should move our 3D cursor. So let's go ahead and put it right here, right on top of the cube, in fact. See that? If I navigate around my interface, I can see that my 3D cursor is resting on top of this cube. Let's go ahead and click on Add, and add my favorite object, the Suzanne monkey. We're going to use this monkey quite a bit throughout this course, so we might as well get familiar with Suzanne. Because I had shift right clicked or moved my 3D cursor to the top of the cube, Suzanne was added right there. In fact, if I shift right click over here or even on the blob, I can rotate around the view and see that my 3D cursor is kind of like sticking right on that metaball. Now, not all objects interact with metaballs, only metaball objects. So if I come over to metaball, I can see I have a few different kinds of metaballs, but unfortunately the monkey will not interact with them. Metaballs only interact with other metaballs. Now that you have an idea how to add objects and move them around, go ahead and populate your scene with some pretty awesome looking objects. And feel free to play with metaballs, because honestly, they're a ton of fun. Now that you've gone ahead and populated your scene with some awesome objects, let's go ahead and investigate the modifiers panel. Now heads up, if you don't have exercise files or you didn't save your previous scene, it's okay. Go ahead and click on Add and add a mesh object to your scene, not a metaball or surface curve. We're only going to focus on meshes from now on. So go ahead and add a mesh to your scene, select on your object, and you'll know it's selected because you'll see an orange, bright orange outline around it. Now, on the right, you'll see a blue wrench. Go ahead and click on it. This is the modifiers panel. It's going to be a panel that you're going to spend quite a bit of time in, so I figured we should cover this much earlier in the course. There are a lot of modifiers available to you, and they're broken up into different sections. Let's start with modify. The modify modifiers allow you to modify the vertex data or the normal data. This is pretty advanced stuff, so for now, just know that if you ever need to do complex things like changing the normals or moving UV maps from one to another, that the modify panel allows you to do all of that, primarily with the data transfer tool. Next is the generate column. This allows you to take the current 3D mesh and generate some interesting stuff with it. Maybe you want to go ahead and subdivide it and make it a lot smoother. Maybe you want to make an array. We'll play with those in a bit. Deform allows you to take the current geometry and deform it. You're not necessarily adding any new geometry, you're just deforming what's already there. One of the more popular things you're going to use is armature, which allows you to take a 3D model and attach it to bones. Armature is the equivalent of rig in other 3D programs. And finally, the physics column, which allows you to add physical properties to your objects. Let's go ahead and play with the generate column. There's quite a number of these, so we're only going to play with a few of them. My first favorite is array. So go ahead and click on array. And move my viewport around here, and I can see that I have added another monkey. I can click on count and add even more monkeys. I can also left click and drag and add 26 monkeys. Now be careful, you can left click and drag quite a bit. You'll end up adding hundreds and hundreds of monkeys and maybe crashing your system. So let's just keep it at 5 for now. There are other things you can do too, like offsetting them differently in different ways. And because relative offset is on, it's using the bounding box of this monkey and shoving it over a little bit. Go ahead and turn that off for right now, and I can do that just by clicking the X icon. Now, if that went too fast, that's okay. We can always undo that really quick. And you can see that there is a little X icon to remove the modifier. One of my other favorite ones is build. When you go ahead and add the build modifier, you might say to yourself, hey, my monkey went nowhere. If I left click and drag either start frame or, better yet, click on the play button, you can see that the monkey starts to build up. Now, start frame is where the building begins, and I can go ahead and just drag this around to see it change. But a better idea, if I just hit escape there and leave that at 1, is to just move my timeline. I can move my timeline really easily. Just left click and drag this little blue thing that appears. In my case, it was around 100, and I just dragged it all the way over to 0. You can also use these play buttons to go ahead and change what frame you're on. All right, let's go ahead and remove build and click on add modifier. Another popular modifier is subdivision surface. So let's go ahead and click on that one. You can see that right away, our object is a lot smoother. Now, there are two kinds of smoothing inside of Blender. There is this subdivision surface, which allows you to add more levels of detail, or basically more geometry. It takes off that really hard coarseness of your 3D model by adding even more 3D vertices, faces, and edges to really smooth the look. But even with all this extra geometry, you can still note that there's a little bit of faceting going around this. So the second thing you want to do is go to Object and look for Shade Smooth. Shade Smooth removes that hard faceting. Now that doesn't mean that it added an infinite amount of geometry. In fact, if I go to my levels here, I can go all the way back to 0. Instead, what Shade Smooth does is cheat to the camera and make things seem a lot smoother, even though they might be pretty coarse. It's kind of a weird concept at first, but I really want to highlight that those are two separate operators that kind of accomplish the same thing. Anyways, the modifiers panel is where you're going to spend quite a bit of time because it allows you to generate and change your models very, very quickly. So getting familiar with it is definitely going to help you on your Blender journey. Now that we've gone ahead and added a few objects and played with some modifiers, it's time to create this into a scene and add some lights. The very first thing I want to do is come over to Add and add a plane. And then I'm going to click on the Scale tool. The shortcut for this is S. I'm just going to hit S and drag, or I can just drag on any one of these items right here. Here we go. I want to make a floor for all of our 3D objects so they're not just floating there in space. Next, I'm going to click on my Move tool, and I want to move this sphere so that my camera can see it. But right now, I don't know what my camera can see, so I'm going to click on this camera icon right here. As you can see, my little sphere here is off the side, so I'm just going to go ahead and move it. And even my lovely metaballs, let's go ahead and move them a little closer. Metaballs can be sometimes kind of weird, by the way. You'll note that it looks like my orange sphere is highlighted, but I can't actually move it. I have to click on this black outline to actually move this sphere. There we go, and let's move it a little bit more forward. Okay, I've created myself a pretty nice looking scene. Now the next step is to see what it would look like with a light. So let's go ahead and I'm going to shift right click anywhere in here, doesn't matter where really, and then go to Add Light, and we're going to add a point light. Now at first, you may not notice anything change, and that's because our view type up here at the top right is set to solid mode. If I come all the way to the right, I can change it to Eevee or rendered mode. We'll talk a lot more about rendering towards the end of this course, but for right now, just know that there are different modes to allow you to see your objects. For example, wireframe lets you see the raw wireframes where you can see edges and faces. Solid shades all of that in to a sort of flat color. Material preview generates some fake lights to let you see what the materials or colors of your objects are. And finally, rendered mode actually lets you go ahead and see what this looks like as close as it can to a final image. Now I can go ahead and move this light around, and you can see that as I'm moving it, things get a little brighter or a little dimmer. Remember how I talked about the properties panel having all sorts of stuff inside of it? On the right here, you might note a green light bulb. So let's go ahead and click on it. This light bulb has a color of white, but maybe I want it to be red. And maybe I want this power to be 100 watts. Hey, take a look at that. Now I've got some pretty cool stuff happening. In the case of lights, you're actually able to switch to different kinds of lights. So up here, remember how I went to add light and we had 4 different types? This is not always the case, but it is the case for lights. Here in the properties panel, I can just change to different kinds of lights. For now, I'm just going to stick to a point light though. You might note that I have a light that is off screen, off my camera to the top right. There's a few ways to select it. but I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to use the outliner. It is called light in the outliner, and you can see it has a value of 1000 watts. And I can go ahead and change it to any color I want. But let's say I wanted to move the light, but I don't want to lose my camera view. Well, you can hit the shortcut G to move that light. Now, if that didn't work for you, make sure that you have light selected over here in the outliner. I'll know it's selected because it is bright orange. The word, at least, is bright orange. The icons are generally also going to be orange, but it's the word light that should be bright orange. Anyways, I'm going to hit G and move it around. Now I can change this into any color I want. If you want to be extra creative, go ahead and add some more lights. There are a lot of different lights. Another one that I really like to use is area light. It broadcasts light out in a sort of square-like pattern. Or, if I shove this down into the ground, you can see it's a square. Over here in these properties panel, I can change it into a disc. Go ahead and add some extra lights and see what an amazing scene you can create. Hopefully you've gone ahead and added some objects and lights to your scene and made it look pretty awesome. Don't forget, you can always change the power and make it really strong if you can't see your initial light for any reason. Some of the more advanced users might say, you know, this gizmo that's in front of me with all the movement, etc., I don't need any of that stuff. Well, remember how we had viewport shading options for render, preview, etc.? Over here on the left, you can go ahead and turn off your overlays. For the purpose of this course, I'm going to leave them always on, but if you're a more advanced user, you can go ahead and turn them on and off as you need so you can get a little bit more real estate in your scene. All right, now that you've gone ahead and made an absolutely gorgeous scene, in my case, actually, I think I want to go a little bit more purple. There we go. Now that you've gone ahead and made an absolutely gorgeous scene, let's go ahead and render it. There are a few things we need to do before we click on the render button. So let's come up to this camera icon, kind of looks like the back of a DSLR, and click on it. We'll talk a lot more about different render engines later on in this course, but for now know that we're going to use the real-time rendering engine called Eevee. There are a ton of settings in here, and I don't want to overwhelm you with all of them, but I will encourage you to play with them. Let's go ahead and touch on a couple of them. The first is ambient occlusion. You may not notice anything initially, but if you drag up this distance, you can start to see how some things get a little darker, especially in these little intersecting kind of darker areas. This is a way to add a little bit more bite to your scene. Another one that's good to play with is bloom. Let's go ahead and turn that on. And much like ambient occlusion lets you really focus in on those dark areas, bloom lets you play a lot more with the brighter areas. Now, in the case of this scene, I don't really have too many lights that are really hot and blooming my scene, but it's good to know what settings to play with. All right, let's move next to this little thing that looks like a printer. This is called output properties. And if I use my middle mouse wheel to go up and down, I can also go ahead and left click this bar to go up and down. I can see I have some settings. If you've never used pixels or rendering before, some of these might be kind of foreign to you, so I'll keep it real simple. 1920 by 1080 pixels is your typical 16 by 9 HD resolution. That means it's pretty high and it'll look pretty great. There's a few things for animation like frame range and frame rate. We'll leave those alone for right now. The most important thing is where are you going to save this file when you render it? Go ahead and click on this little folder icon right next to, in my case, temp. When I click that folder icon, I'm presented with a brand new Blender file view. This lets me navigate my computer and allow me to see where I can save my files. In the case of volumes, you'll see at the top left different drives that are connected to your machine. You'll have some basic system things like your desktop or downloads. And you can even add folder bookmarks or have a collection of all the recent folders you visited. For my purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and click on accept. and I'm going to save it right there. Finally, the moment is here. Go ahead and click on Render, Render Image. Your view will be immediately taken over by the Blender Render view. And since our scene is pretty straightforward and simple, it should render fairly quickly. Look at that. It looks quite nice, and you can see even some statistics, like this took me less than a second, and it used a bunch of memory. Now here's the thing. When you do a single render image, it may not always write that file. However, when you do a render animation, it will always write those files to that directory we just specified. So to be safe, I recommend you click on Image, Save As. And you can see that we're in that same directory that we just specified before. And down here at the bottom, I can go ahead and click on it and rename this to My First Render. On the top right, you can see there are a bunch of different image formats, but I'm going to leave it as a PNG for now. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And guess what, everybody? You've just created your first 3D render. Congratulations! And you did it all inside of Blender. Well done. Now that you know how to render, add objects, and add some lights, I recommend you go ahead and just play around and see what you can do to really make the scene even more awesome.